we're going to have a talk, if there's any time left, from one of Olin's best, Sara Hendren. Sara is an artist and a design researcher whose work engages adaptive and assistive technologies, prosthetics, inclusive design, accessible architecture, and all sorts of related ideas. Her work has been exhibited in the US and abroad and is held in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And her writing and design work have appeared in the Boston Globe, the Atlantic Tech, Fast Code Design, and on National Public Radio, among other places. Work at various stages include ramp design for wheelchair users and skateboarders, low-tech assistive devices, the long-running Accessible Icon project, which she co-founded, and mobility on Mars. She lectures widely and formerly taught at the Rhode Island School of Design. Sara holds a BA in studio art from Wheaton College in Illinois, an MA in European history from UCLA, and a Master of Design with distinction from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Tonight, she will discuss designing for those with special needs. Sara.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy, beautiful May spring. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll be talking tonight a little bit about my own work, but certainly not about the entire space of disability and technology at Olin. It's like a rich space where a number of colleagues and I are working together. So I hope you'll get a little taste tonight of some of that, but I'm pleased to stand here and represent actually far more than me. I want to, in keeping with the theme of the President's Council gathering, I want to just lay out a kind of landscape for you around disability and technology, what we know and what we don't know, and to try to make an argument tonight that we need actually far more resources and from far more unexpected places than so far has been devoted to this territory. So let me show you what I mean by that. I've been working for a long time in writing, in design work, and artwork, and I also have been running a blog for a long time called Abler, on which I've been tracking and commenting on the kind of major trends in prosthetics, in journalism and popular media, this kind of thing. So probably it will be familiar to you, images like this. This is the kind of thing that people send me for the blog all the time once they know I'm interested in this kind of thing. And this was a commercial that ran at the Super Bowl, I think, one of the last couple of years. And you see the story here, that is the best that money can buy, these super high-end legs, absolutely feats of engineering, and that this woman is being compared to this fast car. It's something to celebrate, absolutely, for sure. Or the myoelectric arm and hand with 14 different grip patterns, and the kind of restorative narrative that's happening here about this person getting back an artificial limb that's been lost, and that the engineering swoops in there to become to kind of save the day. Again, stuff that I celebrate, that I'm really interested in. But I also happen to know, because I work in this field, that these kinds of technologies get all the press, every bit of it, all the kind of photography and kind of breathless claims and excitement, sort of futurology, while at the same time, actually, human ability and variation is so much more interesting than just these stories. And let me tell you a couple of them. Probably many of you are familiar with cochlear implants. These are technologies, a lot of R&D has gone into these to restore hearing to people who are deaf. And so this has been a kind of celebrated bit of engineering around deafness and prosthetics. However, if you go down to Gallaudet University near Washington, which is an all-deaf campus, you'll also see an architecture called Deaf Space, which is design principles, 100-item list long, by which architects were commissioned to design around deafness. And so here you can just see a couple of the features where the sight lines are really long. There's no need for walls if ASL is visual, the way the corners are set up to honor the visuality of the language, and so on. So, of course, it's possible to be interested in and celebrate both of these things, cochlear implants and deaf space. But if the young designer or engineer is going into this field, what is he or she to do? Which option to choose? Because here there's a logic of therapy and cure, and here there's a logic of accommodation, of difference, and a kind of normativity. Plenty of people at Gallaudet aren't interested in cochlear implants, and that may be surprising, I think, to the young engineer, but in fact it's so. Deaf culture has a culture with integrity and with a history and so on. Same is true of autism. This is, as you may know, tremendously contested territory right now. These are social robots, and plenty of, again, research going into robotics for therapeutic uses for young people on the autism spectrum. These robots are thought to be good proxies for teaching things like social cues and recognizing emotion, this kind of thing. Again, really interesting as a therapy and cure, but if you look at the website of this IT firm, Lectern, which was started in Denmark by a father of an autistic child, this is an IT firm that's staffed entirely, the IT consultants staffed entirely with people on the autism spectrum. Not as a charity project for them, but because this man made a bet and found that, in fact, it's true that for many people on the autism spectrum, the cognitive sort of wiring is actually exceptionally well suited to IT work. This is not a kind of, this is a business bet that this father made, and in fact, they're very competitive. Again, it's possible to be interested in both these things. It's a both and kind of thing, but how are we to direct young people to think about an inclusive future if some of the technologies that we use are meant to be therapeutic and some of them are meant to actually make broader space for more of us more of the time? This is a kind of neurodiversity approach to autism. And many people, again, in the autism community advocate for seeing themselves as a variation on normal and not something to be fixed. So it's really interesting. I do pay attention to this kind of high-tech work, but I also pay a lot of attention to a place like this, the Jaipur Foot organization in India, which has so far made and distributed over 1 million recycled rubber lower leg prostheses and given them away for free. And so, you know, again, I'm as gee whiz as the next person about this kind of engineering, but my goodness, for impact, for scale and impact, it'd be hard to compete with this kind of thing. So I'm interested in telling those stories and in shining a light on those kinds of stories too. Other really interesting things happening in prosthetics. This is a new design out of Georgia Tech, and I think some people also at Northwestern are looking at this, a tongue sensor and driver for a wheelchair for someone with a high spinal cord injury who doesn't have use of legs or arms. And you might remember Christopher Reeve using the sip and puff headset for directing a wheelchair, and this was a kind of fundamental reversal of that model because that exterior architecture often got jumbled and would have to be recalibrated. So these researchers thought, what if you entirely house that in the mouth cavity? It's enclosed. I think that's just a really interesting way of reversing the problem, like reversing and kind of creatively reinterpreting the issue. Something like this is even more kind of unexpected in the realm of prosthetics. This is a fake bus stop. Many nursing homes in Germany now who treat patients with dementia discovered that if they erected a reasonable, sort of plausible bus stop outside the entrance, that the wander risk associated with dementia would be curbed. Why? Because people would exit the nursing home, see the bus stop and think, I must be going to work, sit there, and then by the time it was discovered that they were missing, the workers in the nursing home would be able to come out, right, and to ask them questions and to say, oh, everything's fine. And it was an incredibly soothing and respectful and dignified way for them to get back in the nursing home. I mean, think about this as a kind of whack on the head, problem solving. So much of dementia is treated pharmacologically or in terms of devices, what we wear on the body, limited to this kind of the human corpus, but this is a kind of urban planning. This has been replicated all over Europe now as a kind of intervention. So what you need to be thinking at all scales to think about human difference across the life cycle, to think about inclusivity, it's much more than replacement limbs. Same thing, this is the green walking man sign in Singapore. So if you are an older adult or someone with a disability, you can buy a card that will automatically grant you up to 13 extra seconds in the crosswalk. So it will kind of acupuncturally on demand extend your crosswalk time. I think that's just like incredibly interesting. Again, I think we think of design for aging as being medicalized and sort of personal fitness and whatever, but what if cities can kind of contract and breathe and accommodate for a slower gait over the life cycle? So I'm really interested in this kind of stuff. So I would say we're at a moment where we're asking, what is ability? And it's actually kind of unclear. It's actually kind of unclear what it is, who do we need to fix, what's normal, what's not normal, and then secondly, how do we build an inclusive world? Well, with new questions, with broader conversations, and with unorthodox approaches. Let me just also suggest the high stakes of this conversation. The WHO and the World Bank did a a global study published in 2011 saying that 1 billion people now in the world live with and experience disability. We can talk later about how they define that. It's a lot of people. Not only that, but the sort of outlook globally is really quite dire. So disabilities associated with all these things, poor health outcomes, education achievements, and so on, high rates of poverty. That same report identifies these factors as the barriers to inclusivity. And you'll notice that there are things here, yes, lack of accessibility that involve technology. You'll also see something as amorphous and diffuse as negative attitudes and stigma. How do you address that as an engineer, a designer? How do you tackle these things that are far more about people's perceptions, about the way that we speak to each other? This is a more ambitious kind of problem. So I'm interested, in other words, in a lab. I say that my lab is a technical and social lab, that we both solve problems in the engineering paradigm when they're presented to us, and then we also ask questions. Not only better questions for what to build to solve those problems, but better questions in general about who we are as a people and what inclusivity is. So I teach a class called Investigating Normal at Olin, which is about adaptive and assistive technologies. And then I have this lab, the Adaptation and Ability Group. So I'll just tell you a few stories about my own classroom and then some of others on campus. Investigating Normal is a design depth at Olin, so all of our students will have come through Design Nature in the first year. They'll also have had our user-centered design class called User-Oriented Collaborative Design. So they've had some time, they've had their first 2 years under their belt. They come to design depth to kind of dig in a little bit more deeply. We've had some very kind of legible, practical partnerships with big institutions like Children's Hospital Boston, but also our neighborhood, so Newman Elementary, as a satellite of the Adaptive Design Association. So I won't tell you about that, but those are very kind of, I think, familiar engineering stories. But I want to tell you actually a little bit more about something that's a little bit less familiar, and that is some Design for One projects that we also do in Investigating Normal. One was a partnership with this man, Chris Hinojosa, who was born with one arm, you can see here. And Chris has had 4 or 5 maybe arms, the best that you can get, built for him since he was a child. You know, all these doctors and his family trying to, like, thinking he must need an arm. Like, how can you possibly not have 2 arms? Like, how can you possibly do the world without it? And it turns out that Chris, because he was born this way, the body, of course, is radically adaptive in plastic, and he does really quite well. He's a microfluidics engineer at Emulate Bio. Some of you might know this, and he's figured out all kinds of simple workarounds to do his life, to cook and to clean and to do everything that he needs to do. And so I love this moment when he comes into my classroom, because we're in a classroom of engineers and he should be somebody that we're looking to fix, but in fact he's not asking us for one in any kind of universal way. So we pause and have this moment together and go, what is the role of the engineer here? What is the role of technology here? And so Chris, because he was game and interested and does have some things that are difficult for him, asked us to make him a single-use arm, one that he would use for certain things and not for others. And he picked rock climbing because he thought that would be a good thing for him to learn to do, and it was quite challenging for him. So I had 2 teams of students working on this. One who were working on the socket, just the socket interface. And if you know anything about prosthetics, just the socket alone, getting that fitting to match the morphology of the body without chafing and rubbing and a tremendous amount of discomfort, that's a huge issue on its own. And then another team working on the extension. So they did working with Fusion 360 and Scanect, and just showing you some of the renderings of the design they got. And here I'll show you a little bit of the process. So these students, I mean, we just had a fantastic time prototyping through some really rough and ready materials to get to this socket interface, and documented the whole thing beautifully. Yeah. So here's the rendering of the mostly final and the fitting on Chris. And then he did go rock climbing with it. Now you can see this is actually, this is a pretty 1.0 prototype. It was pretty heavy and pretty clunky. Like, we had a sort of proof of concept on our hands. The socket was really more impressive, I think, in terms of the engineering, but Chris now uses this arm the socket with a different extension, he does need therapeutically to load the arm, and that's what I think he thought the rock climbing might get at that. But this is, for his physical therapy purposes, this is actually becoming the place where he really uses it, because he needs to load that to combat the atrophy on that side. But all of this was an invitation to students to think differently, to approach the problem differently, to think, yes, in technical terms, but to think about their user in a new way, and to think about him as a true interlocutor, as an equal there, that there was no heroic engineering happening here. And indeed that the future of prosthetics might be in single-use kind of modularity. We don't know, right? I think that there's plenty of low-cost materials and 3D printing and so on, plenty of research to suggest that we're heading in another paradigm in general. Another one is this a partnership with a woman named Amanda Kasha, who has a form of dwarfism. She's under 4 feet tall. She's an art historian and a curator, and she spends a lot of time on the lecture circuit. And you can see on here, I'm showing you a wooden lectern that she had built for herself at her scale. But she needed, because she travels, she said, you know, I really need like a portable, collapsible, super lightweight lectern. And so she called me up and said, Sarah, do you want to work on this? And I said, my goodness, yes, please come. So she came to Olin, and we worked on some initial designs. This is actually pre-Olin. I worked on just some initial designs, but then she came to the class with that cardboard prototype, and then students set about making her one that would actually work. And this was a design, build, deliver kind of project. So students had to, you know, think through, like, what's the kind of simplest number of folds to collapse this thing? What's the most intuitive way for it to open and shut? What's the geometry that this thing wants to be to try to get it on the road and make it robust? And again, it's got to be lightweight, all this kind of stuff. And they eventually ended up using carbon fiber, which you don't have to do. You don't have to make a lectern out of carbon fiber to have a lightweight, you know, sturdy material, but it is quite good at that. And what we loved was that it has this symbolic resonance of aerospace and automotive applications. I mean, it's a beautiful juxtaposition to create a kind of a lectern, a super high performance lectern for one person, for someone, for an art historian with dwarfism, to like smash together your expectations of that high performance material with this unlikely user. So students learned all about the process of working with and curing carbon fiber, and they made this quite clever. Here's Amanda using it. She travels and performs on that now. Can you imagine like what a nice moment that is when she comes into a room like this, and here's the interior architecture, which is scaled for norms and averages, and then Amanda, you know, comes into the room, and then, like, you know, in a moment, like all the architecture comes to her briefly. Like, what does that tell us about mass customization in the future? Like, could Amanda plug in her specs to other manufacturing streams and actually get a scale that she can actually live with, rather than always her coming to this myth of the average? Thirdly, this is something we just completed. This is a partnership with Alice Shepard, who's a choreographer and a dancer, and also, as you see, a wheelchair user. Alice came to campus. We're kind of playing with this micro-residency prototype, so having people come for 3 or 4 days, speak to us about their work, engage in classes, and so on. And so Alice did do that. And danced for us. We set up in Milas Hall, if you know it, a provisional dance studio. We audited our whole campus. We're lucky at Olin that we have new enough architecture that we've got plenty of inclines to test, and plenty of sort of physics to examine. She was in with biomechanics students and mechanics students. Sorry, I should say, this is not an investigating normal. So this is a class, this is a project that's actually housed in Zhenya Zastavkar's physics class. So that was like a kind of beautiful bit of timing that it came together in this way. So they did motion capture in the motion capture studio. And then students prototyped some ramps for her to dance on. And this is what she came to us with. She said, you know, I've got plenty of kind of a whole suite of moves and a whole choreography for using the chair in an artful way, but I've never really injected a ramp that's not an access ramp, but a playful, expressive ramp into a dance context. And so students did that. And she tried to figure out, like, what's the kind of maximum speed and the maximum height, and how can she both exert control, but also really amplify the kind of playful aspects of this. So students went through a couple of models between her visits, and then ended up fabricating an entire ramped landscape, 24 feet square. Can you imagine? These are first-year students with almost no fabrication experience, and look at this thing. I mean, and so then so Alice came back with her collaborator Laurel Lawson to start to choreograph a dance piece on this design. And so they did, and they tested it out for several days, and they performed for us. I'll just show you. I mean, they make it look so easy, but you can, whoops, but you can, you can imagine how tricky that is to actually really exert, again, the kind of control that you need, and to both be at play on this thing, but to also manage it. So they spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do we kind of engage with and work on this? And to their knowledge, this has never been done before. That is a ramp as a dance object on a stage, not as a prop, but as an entire landscape. So they're handing this off to the CAD files to a stage shop now, and they're going to use it in the next performance season in the fall and in the spring. So all of these, and I've just given you like the tiniest little glimpse, but I think all of these projects ask us to do something that we don't tend to do in the legacy of rehabilitation engineering, and that is the realm of prosthetics historically that we inherit. Rehabilitation engineering and all the assumptions that comes with, that it's a medical kind of pursuit. And instead, I'm asking students to reimagine what is ability, again, to question their assumptions, to take unorthodox approaches. I think we have the liberty at the university with respect to industry to ask what might be possible, and to give ourselves the latitude to ask those really big questions. Again, I think a register of mass customization is at hand here. There is something that we could sort of pursue. From user-centered to even user-initiated design, again, in disability, that's radical. It's a long history of people being designed for, spoken to, and without their involvement. And then from the medically necessary, or what we've decided is medically necessary, to that which is also socially expressive, to counter that stigma. Can the things that we build address those thornier kind of barriers that the WHO is naming? And that is our perceptions of each other, what we can do, what we can't do, independence, interdependence, all these kinds of things. So that's investigating normal and kind of my lab's work, again in collaboration with a physics professor at Olin named Shenya, that ramp project. I want to also just show you Engineering for Humanity. You may know Lynn Stein and Katrin Lynch, who's not here, an anthropologist, created a class a number of years ago that matches Olin students with older adults in the community to do design build projects, also in a design for one kind of paradigm, but with a rich anthropology of aging as part of that classroom. It's been very inspiring for me. You can see students here going out into the field, visiting, talking with, experiencing recreation, leisure, eating, all kinds of activities. And then Katrin and Lynn, and Katrin now and Ella Ben-Ur have set up in the classroom then a whole series of kinds of exercises for students to walk through challenges and tasks that may be difficult with those older adults in the lab with them. So things like arthritic constraints on hand joints and what that makes difficult to do in kind of a daily living way. And these are not students who are simulating that experience. They're actually having that experience with a partner right there, saying, what is it that's difficult for you? What do you do next? What are the 3 moves that make this work? So you can see here just sort of preparing food or trying to simulate certain kinds of vision conditions, but then asking always the primacy of the person in the room. What is the reality for you? What's difficult? What's easy? So, and here's a representative example, a woman named Cindy, who's local here in Wellesley. Cindy had a heart attack at age 60 and a number of complications, a long coma, the result of which was an amputation of both of her lower legs. And then also you can see here almost all of her digits, all of her fingers. So she woke up after 6 months in a radically new body and has had to adjust accordingly. So she worked with students to make these a kind of, not a universal hand, but a kind of 3D printed, 3-fingered extension on her hand for things like the sort of minutiae that make her life possible. It's for turning the pages when she reads to her grandchildren, things like that. things like wrapping presents. It's something that's really important to her. This is actually a super technical project. I mean, all kinds of iterations and all kinds of calibration, and this student went on to get a great internship in 3D printing because she had spent so many hours making this happen. But so that's engineering for humanity. Katrin and I found this woman, Cindy, so compelling that we actually built a whole website that's all about the simple adaptations that she's made and that her prosthetist has made for her. It's at engineeringathome.org. We built this, we photographed and cobbled together all of these deceptively humble objects that actually make Cindy's life possible. And partly that's because Cindy, after a long insurance process, qualified for one of these $90,000 arms. And literally it is gathering dust in the closet in her house right now. She has no use for it here. And she qualified for and trained for the best that your money can buy. But the thing that's actually revolutionary in her life is this thing. It's a silicone cap that goes on top of her hand that makes her able to write in her own handwriting. Does she need to actually do her own handwriting? She doesn't. Speech to text is actually great, but she wanted to. She wanted to write thank you notes. It made her feel like herself. She saw it was her own handwriting. Literally, this thing can hardly be calculated in its cost. It's pennies. So we find this to be not a rejection of that high-tech arm. For some people, that's transformational tech. We love it. We love it. We're pro high-tech engineering. It's transformational for some people. We also, though, want to celebrate, expand a canopy, look for the engineering where it's happening in places that we might not expect. Perhaps especially when it's low-tech, right, like this. So we just got these like amazing photographs made, you know, so that you would bring design attention and see those things as such. And we wrote like a whole manifesto even that we call it. This counts too, engineering at home. I'm pleased to say that we got invited by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to include some replications of these objects in a big design exhibition that's opening up there next spring. They're expanding a whole new design wing, and it's an exhibition called The Future of Design, Technology Shapes Everyday Life. So imagine, this is going to be like big projects in geoengineering and like Cindy's pen cap. Like, you have to love that. You have to love that juxtaposition. And they are so excited about it. And I feel like, what is our role here? It's really actually about Cindy, but we tried to bring design attention to amplify a practice that's already going on and to find engineering in places where it's not expected to be. You know, I mean, we're actually, Cindy, you know, ain't no Brooklyn hipster, you know, like not doing her maker thing, but in fact, like, look at the cleverness of all this stuff, you know? And nobody expects her to do it because of who she is and where she is in her life. And what we say counts. What we say counts. So I'm really excited about that. That's about as short a story as I could tell about that. I also want to just bring attention to my colleague Paul Ruvelo's work in adaptive technologies for low vision. He's looking at shopping as an area, especially for age-related blindness, where people want to maintain that kind of choice and agency around shopping. So he's done some really interesting patching together existing technologies. And I think he's finding especially a lot of promise in Google Tango, which is still being kind of prepared for the consumer market, but it's a tablet of Google's that has sensing, 3D sensing and spatial sensing and so on. So they're thinking about how you would hook up like a shopper with a sighted volunteer elsewhere with a video stream, providing guidance and cues, right, to make choices in real time in a store setting. So this is very much in beta, under kind of under construction. Here's in the lab, the testing environment that they set up. So they're working locally with the Carroll Center for the Blind. We're super lucky in Massachusetts to have all kinds of resources available to us. But I'm trying to suggest to you, again, this like panoply of and set of options. We do high-tech work, we do low-tech work, we do some artwork, we do a lot of engineering, that all of this is a big ecology around disability. Why? Because it's one of the world's thorny issues. The stakes are really high, and it's unclear how it is that we should tackle it. And those are the features, surely, of the best research areas, that what you need to know is just around the bend, that you need a lot of people in the room, this kind of thing. Finally, I'll just tell you that we're part of, I just represented Olin at teachaccess.org, which is, this is just maybe 2/3 of the big companies in Silicon Valley and some of the universities who are partnering now to try to get accessibility in engineering part of the undergraduate curriculum. And why is that? Because people like Yahoo say, they ask people when they walk in the door, what do you know about accessibility for the digital space? And the answer is always nothing, nothing at all. And they're not looking for accessibility specialists, they're looking for young people to just build in mind, just to have as a checklist as they build apps and so on, who else can use this? How would a blind person use this? I mean, I think a lot of young people think that that blind people don't use the internet, for instance. I mean, there are a lot of those myths that are still out there. So this is a quite urgent matter, but it's an exciting one. So we got together at Yahoo just a couple of weeks ago to say, okay, what are the constraints on industry? What's happening there? What do we know about what's happening in the university? What's realistic? What's the minimum viable? What's the ideal situation? And then how do we really infuse this into curricula? It's super exciting. So right, what is ability? It is really unclear, and it's never been more exciting. It's never been more exciting than to work in this area now. How do we build an inclusive world? Yes, with new questions, creativity, broader conversations, unorthodox approaches. And I say with hybrid, interdisciplinary, unconstrained research, all of us. We have critical mass at Olin. We have robotics, we have anthropology, we have design, bioengineering, physics. I mean, people from trained in these fields, all working and working together on this stuff, working together in rich and collaborative, productive ways. People always ask, so I will tell you, that this is my entry into disability. This is my first of my 3 children. Graham, this is when he was 3 years old, learning to walk. Finally walked at 3.5. That was a long wait. The stakes are high. I have those stakes too. I need a better world in the most kind of material ways. I have enough experience doing this that I know that a room this size also contains people in it who also have those stakes in your families and among people you know. So I hope that you'll collaborate with us in the future. So thank you.
So what do you think? One of Olin's real missions is to teach more than knowledge and skill. It's to teach mindset, it's to teach passion, it's to teach intrinsic motivation. Empathy is at the heart of this. I don't think you can go through this kind of an experience as a student and not feel bonded in some really rudimentary way to other people, to dedicate your life to make a positive impact. If you think about what it means to be successful in life, there's a number of really interesting books. There's one that just came out by Angela Duckworth. It's called Grit. It's about passion plus perseverance. It turns out that the data shows that a 3 times better predictor of positive life outcomes than either intelligence or knowledge is grit. And at the heart of grit is intrinsic motivation. And I think Sara is at the ground level at creating intrinsic motivation in every student at Olin. So thank you so much for what you do. And really central, I was struck by your talk in a number of ways. One of them, I just finished a book that was recommended to me by Tommy Cecil, one of our board members who's here. This is a book, one of the latest books by Atul Gawande called Being Mortal. Has anybody heard of this book? Okay, so if you read it to the end, you find out that this is about the end stage of life and how do physicians deal with this. And what he eventually concludes in a very heartrending story about the end of life of his father is that being mortal, being human, is about self-expression. And if you can't express yourself, it's very hard to remain intrinsically motivated to live. And I think the arts are right at the heart of self-expression. So I don't see engineering and arts as being different disciplines. I think they're the same thing.